Even more sad news this week. Frank Borman, the commander of Gemini 7 and Apollo 8, has died at the age of 95.
So today, we're celebrating his life, and to do this, we're joined by Chris Henry of the EAA Museum in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, home of the Frank Borman collection.
Do you have any Frank Borman stories? We'd love to hear them. Let us know via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website.
But right now, it's time for episode 168 of the Space and Things Podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but it is right this time. You're listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 168 of our podcast. How are you doing, Emily?
I am doing good. I'm a little under the weather, but hopefully nobody can hear it. So, I had a lot of tea before I did this. So how are you doing, Dave?
Well, tea is the cure for everything. So
it is.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. It's been an emotional week, so I think we should just get started with our main feature this week. And I'm going to admit right now that, as I just said, it's likely that I may get quite emotional during this episode, but we will do our very best. And as Emily said in the intro, this week we've lost another of our heroes. On November 7th, Frank Borman died at the age of 95.
Frank Frederick Borman II was one of the iconic astronauts of the early space age and influenced space policy outside of his astronaut career. A graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and one of the first graduates of the Aerospace Research Pilot School along with new 9 astronaut Jim McDivitt, the no-nonsense serious Borman was selected to NASA's second group in September 1962, which is not bad for a pilot whose early career was nearly dive-bombed by a perforated eardrum during the 1950s. Now, Borman, even for an astronaut, was uniquely goal-oriented. He stated matter-of-factly in a PBS interview, "I was there mainly because of the Cold War. The Apollo program was a battle in the Cold War. That's why it was funded. That's why it was started. And of course, it had a lot of other virtues, but it was a battle in the Cold War and we won. That was my main interest. I didn't go into the NASA program to pick up rocks or go to the moon or anything else. I went in there because I was a military officer and that was the next notch in my profession."
Borman was initially slated to fly on Gemini 3 alongside Alan Shepard, but an inner ear disorder grounded the latter astronaut. Gemini 3 would instead feature the talents of Virgil Gus Grissom and John Young. However, Borman still gained a plum assignment, and that was the command of Gemini 7, alongside good friend and mission pilot Jim Lovell in December 1965. This mission set a spaceflight endurance record of 14 days, showing that astronauts could survive a longer duration flight to the moon. In addition, Borman and Lovell, in part, performed the first rendezvous between 2 crewed space vehicles, Gemini 7 and Gemini 6, which was crewed by Wally Schirra and Thomas P. Stafford. And they briefly met up in Earth's orbit. Following his return, Borman was promoted to colonel in the U.S. Air Force, becoming the youngest person to hold that military rank at age 37.
The Apollo 1 tragedy of January 27, 1967 changed the entire program, and Borman assumed a role that made Apollo safer and ready to fly before the decade's end. He oversaw the changes to the Apollo Command Module at North American Aviation and in many ways became an unsung hero of the program. By 1968, a new assignment beckoned command of Apollo 8, which became the world's first crewed circumlunar spaceflight. Much has been written about this iconic spaceflight, culminating with a moving televised reading of Genesis on Christmas Eve 1968. In many ways, Borman and his crew, Lovell and lunar module pilot Bill Anders, are credited with saving 1968, one of the most tumultuous years during that decade. The Earthrise photo captured during this mission remains one of the last century's most famous, breathtaking images.
Following Apollo 8, Borman was assigned as a liaison to President Richard Nixon and oversaw the president's remarks during Apollo 11, NASA's first moon landing. This speaks to the enormous influence Borman wielded during that time. Ironically, the admitted Cold War warrior paved the way for US-Soviet collaboration in space. Borman's trip to the Soviet Union during that time undoubtedly set the scene for future US-Soviet efforts in space, such as 1975's Apollo-Soyuz test project mission. This is despite Borman memorably referring to a Russian general as a candy-assed, white wine-drinking bomber pilot during this visit.
That's pure poetry.
Beautiful.
Post-NASA, Borman became the CEO of Eastern Airlines in 1975. His face and image became part of the airline's advertising during this time. While Borman resigned from Eastern in 1986, I believe, his retirement year saw him pursue private business ventures and restore vintage aircraft alongside his much-loved wife, Susan, with whom he had 2 children, Frederick and Edwin. He also wrote his autobiography, Countdown, with Robert J. Serling in 1988. When Susan began suffering the symptoms of Alzheimer's, Borman remained devoted to her as her primary caretaker. He and Susan were married for over 70 years, only separated by her 2021 passing. Frank and Susan Borman are now reunited in the heavens.
And so today we're talking to Chris Henry. Now, some of our listeners may have listened to the Apollo 13 Minute podcast, for which Chris was a co-host alongside Jim O'Kane. It's an incredible podcast where each episode they focus on a single minute of Ron Howard's Apollo 13 movie. They interviewed some incredible people in the making of that podcast, including Frank Borman and a very special guest, Emily Carney.
Chris is the museum programs coordinator of the Experimental Aircraft Association Museum in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which is home to the Frank Borman collection, among other incredible exhibits. In this role, he had built up a very strong friendship with Frank, so we reached out to see if he would speak to us today to tell us some stories about this incredible man.
10, 9, we have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us this week, and we're sorry it's under such sad circumstances. Now, before we get to talking about Frank, please let us know a bit about yourself and how you ended up at the EAA Museum and how you met Frank Borman.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I agree. I wish it was under a better time. So a little bit about me. I've been an airplane nerd since I was probably about 7 or 8. Wanted to be a construction worker, oddly enough. And then I saw this movie called Top Gun, and that kind of ruined everything for me. So as far as a construction worker goes, went to school, became an air traffic controller. I was a medical helicopter dispatcher. And then I did ATC for a while, and then I started working here. I'd been coming to the air show here since the 90s, but really always I wanted to work here. I knew this was where my passion was. So I started working here about 11 years ago. And actually started, when I started in the Apollo stuff, I would start with hosting some gatherings during not just the air show, but throughout the year in the museum, some reunions. A lot of times it was around our B-17 that we have. So I was getting B-17 veterans. And then our CEO, Jack Pelton, had said, hey, we really should look at doing a reunion with Apollo 13. So I was like, yeah, that'd be really cool. And I didn't realize that what he was saying was, Chris, go reach out to these people. So it was really wild that I got to reach out, and I got to host 2 surviving crew members of Apollo 13 and Gene Kranz and a few others. Got to know them pretty well. They were just such wonderful people that coming back, we do a Space Day event every year here, and we get a different speaker. And I had reached out to Gene to see if he would talk in our museum, and he said, "Oh, I've just accepted to do something in Houston. However, I'll get you somebody. I know a guy that would be perfect." And I said, "Okay." And that was it. I never talked to Gene again about the subject. And it was about a week later, I get a phone call, and somebody on a cell phone is really kind of garbled. And all I can make out is, "That thing you need in October, I'll come speak at it." And I'm like, okay, I can't hear who this is. And he's like, "Okay, hold on a second." And he gets inside and he goes, "Can you hear me now?" And I was like, "Yeah." And the voice on the other end says the speaker you need in October, I'll come do it. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, well, who is this? And he was like, this is Frank Borman.
Wow.
And I was just quiet for a second because like, yeah, I'm just like, and then he's just like, like Apollo 8, I was like, no, oh God, like, no, I know who you are. And that was the first time I ever talked to him. And I hosted him a little bit later for that event. And, we're like, hey, we'll set up your airfare. And he's like, no, I'm just going to fly my T-34 there. I'll be there, and just pick me up at the airport.
Nice.
It was kind of a stiff wind day. I mean, it was a little bumpy day. And we went out, me and a friend of mine, and we're like, well, hopefully he can make it in. But if not, maybe we'll have to go to a different airport to go pick him up. And he makes this beautiful 3-point landing. I mean, just gorgeous in this like stiff, bumpy wind day. And he taxis up and he gets out. And he just like pulled his aviators off, and he's like, "I'm Frank Borman." And we always laughed that it was like the I'm Rick James. Like you were just like, "Yep, you are," And I had a ladder there, like a step ladder, and he's just like, "What's that for?" I'm like, "Well, in case you need help getting down." And he's like, "I'm not that old," And and we were just kind of off and running. That is literally the first time I ever talked to and first met Frank.
So when was that?
Geez, that had to be, I'm thinking 2016, something like that.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that's such a cool story. I love that.
It was a friendship I never prepared myself for. Him and I just really hit it off. My wife and him hit it off. This was the first event that I was working where like my wife got to come along and got to kind of see what I do. And it was really funny because my wife and her mindset was, I'm with you and we are hosting this dignitary. And Frank, his mindset is, this is a lady and I need to open the door for her. But in my wife's mind, it was, I need to make sure I open the door for Frank. So they actually would start arguing and then start bumping each other out of the way on purpose of the doors so they could try to open the door for one another. So we actually have a picture somewhere of my wife and Frank trying to beat each other to the car door to open it for one another.
Wow.
So it really became this really goofy scenario that I never in a million years thought would happen. And, what happened is, when you get to host these folks, they're wonderful people. They're so good to you that you can't help but feel like, wow, they're kind of my friend. But you also want to respect their privacy. So, I would thank someone for coming, and then you keep in touch with them, but you don't really bug them too much. You don't want to be that. They get a lot of that. And after that space day thing, Frank would just kind of out of nowhere call once in a while. I'm like, what are you doing? And I'm like, no, I'm at work, but it'll go over to talk to you, And we would just talk airplanes for a few minutes. And we'd be like, all right, well, I'll catch you later. And I remember coming home from work, it was maybe about a month after we had hosted them. And I told my wife, I'm like, I don't know how to say this, but I think I'm friends with Frank Borman. And she was like, what do you mean? And she's like, he just kind of calls and we chat and we talk airplanes and then that's it. Like, there's no point, like, we're not working on anything. Like, we're just kind of chatting airplane. It took like a good month of that going on. We were just sort of like, oh, I think this is just a friendship. One I was very lucky to have.
Absolutely. Okay, so how did the Frank Borman collection end up at the EAA Museum?
Well, so it was one of those calls. I was walking through the halls of the museum after I had joined the museum team, and he called, and I still remember it because he said, "Are you in the middle of anything?" And I said, "Would you care if I was?" And he was like, "Nope." And I was like, "Okay." Frank was like, "Hey, in the museum there isn't a lot of space stuff." And that was an understatement. We had exactly one item that was actually space related, and that was two. We had our Spaceship One mock-up; it's a replica, and we had a bumper sticker that went up on the shuttle. I think with Hugh Gibson and a couple others. That was it. That was the extent of our space collection. And then I said, Frank, he said, is that because you're not interested, or is it just because it's hard to get? And I said, well, it's because it's hard to get. And for anybody listening that works for Aviation Museum or even if you collect, that stuff's really tough to get, especially when you start talking about iconic missions or really historic missions. And Frank said, well, I have a few items. Do you want them? And I will give them to you. And, we were blown away because technically that makes us an air and space museum, which changes, where you are. And
Yeah.
so we said, yeah. And he said, well, I'm not getting them to you. You got to come out and get them out in Montana. So I said, okay. And we started talking. He goes, I think a van will be big enough, and well, we go out there and I'll never forget. We drive out at me and Zach, who was our curator and at the time, and Adam, who has an ongoing joke about chocolate flavored beer with Frank. And we get there and Frank goes, hey, I've changed my mind. And for a brief second, I was like, oh my God, like he doesn't want to give us anything. And I'm going to have to explain this like massive trip to Montana to my work. And he said, I've decided to give you everything.
Wow.
Can you take it all? Would you take it all? So we went out there thinking we were getting about 20 pieces. We came home with over 1,000 individual artifacts. Took us about 5 days of packing and loading and documenting. The neat thing is we filmed myself and Frank just walking around because it was all up in his hangar. His hangar was kind of done up like a man cave. And we walked around his hangar and he just walked us through each artifact and we filmed it. And then that way, when we came back, we knew what to put on tag and what each thing was. It was just funny because he was showing us like different photos of like dignitaries he met, and he'd be like, that guy or that person was really cool. And he'd go to the next one. He'd be like, that person was kind of a jerk, and he would just like keep going.
I hate to have to interrupt you, but did he ever talk to you about the candy-ass Russian, white wine drinking Russian general that he discussed in Countdown?
Yeah.
That part in that book changed my life. Yeah. I swear to God. I read that book and I was like, this is hysterical. He almost caused an international incident. Oh, yeah. Did he talk about that?
He touched on it a little bit, only that happened. And then it was funny because the first time when we were starting to fill out paperwork, I had never heard him use that phrase. We were filling out paperwork. He was like, oh, I don't want to cause too much trouble. But, I want to make sure we get all the paperwork right. We were like, absolutely. But, I'm not a candy ass. We're like, oh my God, like Frank said it, But it was amazing. One of the most powerful pieces we got was a picture of Susan that's on Beta Claw. And he took that up there with him on Apollo 8, but he wouldn't remove it from his pocket because he said he was afraid that it would distract him from his job, but he wanted her with him, so he got it in his pocket. And sorry, I wasn't ready for that. That's a lot, that's the kind of guy he was. So Susan mattered a lot to him, more than anything. And so we wanted to make sure we put Susan in the exhibit. He gave a really great interview out in Billings, the Billings Tribune, I believe it was. And they did this cool interview. And in it, he talked about how the greatest accomplishment in his life wasn't any of the missions. It was getting Susan to agree to marry him.
Oh.
So he had reached out and we asked them, because we were like, why mess with that? That was perfect how we got it. And we asked them if we could have that sound clip, and they gave it to us. And now when you go to the exhibit and you hold your phone, like a smartphone, over with picture of Susan, and when you hold your phone over Susan's picture, that actually plays, and it comes out, and it's him talking about her. Hope I can get through this interview. I didn't. I guess I wasn't prepared for that. I thought it.
The air got a little it's a little dusty at my house as well. So.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in. I think it goes to show how much he trusted you and the museum to give you that photo, which he took on Apollo 8 and other things as well. But, a photo that he took with him and held so dear to himself on that mission where he may not have come home.
Yeah.
And there it is for all of us now to see, and you are the custodians of it. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And certainly having it there with his voice as well, as you just described, makes it an even more wonderful exhibit. So you've completely justified his faith in you in displaying it, because the way you've displayed it, in my opinion.
I really appreciate you saying that. We worked, so his ranch was, I want to say it was about an hour and a half outside of Billings at the time. Now, A, it's beautiful. B, it was wintertime. And C, the closest town was an hour and a half away. That was it. Billings was like the closest town that had like stores and There was like a gas station in between, and that was about it. So it took us several days. We would have to get up in the morning. We were staying in Billings. So we would wake up, have breakfast, clean out the stores that we could find of all their packing material, tape, bubble wrap, everything. Because remember, we thought we were only getting like 12 pieces or 20 pieces, maybe. We would drive out to the ranch, work until lunch, take a break, come back into town, eat, restock, go back out, and we'd work till about 9 o'clock at night, and then we would come home, call it a day. So we worked some pretty long days, and I told you that story to tell you that, we were kind of wiped out. We were kind of, you're done. We're all packed up though. And we're getting ready to leave. We had to rent another truck. We had a rental truck that we had paid as well as the van. And as we're getting ready to leave, I'll never forget, he said, I'm trusting you with my life.
Oh, wow.
And, when Frank told you that, you're like, up until that point, like we were like, this is really cool. These are going to be amazing on display. And, and to Frank, he was like, yeah. And he was pretty casual about it. But when we left, and he said, I'm trusting you with my life. Suddenly that got real. And then, we had, I can't remember how many hours it was to drive home. We weren't going to make it in one night. So I remember we slept in shifts so that we could watch the truck, because we were so afraid that, God forbid, somebody broke into this truck. We had it locked and everything, but we just slept in shifts. We're like, we can pull this for a night or two, so that there was never a night or never a part of the night where somebody wasn't keeping an eye on the vehicle. It was a rough trip. I remember we got back, we immediately got an inventory together, and we built an exhibit. It was actually done in time for December 2018. So it was the 60th anniversary of Apollo 8.
Yeah.
He came out, he was a Wright Brothers speaker that year, and then he cut the ribbon.
Nice.
So we were almost like 60 years right on. And I'll never forget, he cut the ribbon, he dedicated the exhibit, and he was really proud of what we had done with it. And then that night at the banquet, he spoke. And while we were rehearsing and kind of going through everything in the daytime for the banquet, our VP, Rick Larson here, Rick said, well, you got to figure out how to end it, and he kind of joked, and he's like, man, it'd be really cool if you recreated your ending from the broadcast Christmas Eve '68. And Frank said, yeah, I'll just do that. And we're like, whoa, okay, so we had it all queued, and I was like, Frank, do you need me to make cue cards? And I just remember Frank would get this glimmer in his eye when he was about to give you a bunch of grief, and it was all in good fun. And he just goes, I'm the one that said it, right? Yeah. And we did. He recited that, and you can just hear a pin drop in this room full of 600 people in our museum. There he is, Frank, up there reciting his Christmas Eve part of that transmission. And then I had him back for AirVenture one year when we had I think we had 7 or 8 Apollo astronauts. We had Gene Kranz and a couple of guys from Mission Control here. And Frank calls me, he says, I'm flying myself. We knew that. But he said, problem, there's weather between here and Billings. So he said, I either come 2 days early or I don't come at all. Now, normally in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, it is not hard to get a hotel room. That 1 week in July, it's extremely tough to get a hotel room.
Yeah.
The world's largest air show. But we can't have this astronaut reunion and not have Frank, So we're like, yeah, come early. We'll figure it out. We were able to get his room bumped out. However, we had nothing on his itinerary for those 2 days. So I was like, Frank, what are you going to do for 2 days? And he's like, I'm just going to ride around on the golf cart with you. And I'm like, all right, like this is going to be interesting. So like people would call and they'd just be like, hey, there's this fire we need you to come put out, and have it drive over there. And they'd be like, oh my God, that's Frank Borman. And I was like, well, yeah, but what's the problem? And they were like, well, never mind, we'll take care of that. But that's Frank, and about the third or fourth time that happened, he was like, well, are you going to put me on the payroll or what? So, but it's also extremely busy. So like if you're on staff, you don't really get to eat on time. So there were a few days where it was 1, 2 o'clock and we couldn't get something to eat. And I never lived that down, that I starved him and how badly I mistreated Frank. He would call me, he would call me every Christmas Eve, demand to talk to my wife. And then he would make sure that she was cooking dinner and not me, because he wanted to make sure that we were actually going to have Christmas dinner. So that is the kind of stuff that my niece, Abby, was a volunteer, and several times throughout that week, he would just look at her and he'd be like, "We're gonna eat today, aren't we?" And fast forward a couple years, I got to host Michael Collins. And Michael Collins had asked, is there any way that we could just go sit on a flight line in an air-conditioned vehicle and watch the air show for a few minutes? Had his daughters came with us. Really, really cool. And he was having something to drink, air conditioning, watching the air show. And he had just had something to eat. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, if Frank ever finds out that like Michael Collins ate on time and, well, I had told Michael Collins this and he's like, oh, I'm going to let Frank know. And he does. And then I get like, it's like minutes later, I get a phone call from Frank and it's just like, what is this? He's like, Apollo 8 comes, you just roll us in the dirt. He goes, Apollo 11 is there. You're taking care of them. And it was hilarious. Like, so I never lived it down. I mean, I talked to Frank this Saturday before everything happened. And he was still giving me grief about the bad food that I would give him when he would come out here. So it was so much fun. Like whenever you'd call, we talked maybe, I don't know, we would talk probably about like once every other week, something like that, the last few years. I mean, it was pretty wild.
That is wonderful. That is really wonderful. Thank you for sharing these stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a great time visiting your museum almost a year ago right now, and the exhibit's wonderful. A big part of it is his role in Apollo 1. Obviously, you've got some great artifacts there. Did you ever get him talking about that or about his relationship with Ed? Because they were close, weren't they?
I mean, and there might be some folks that would pop up to be the same level as Ed. I feel that Ed was always his best friend. And Pat was very close with Susan. They were very, very close. And a couple of things, I mean, he did talk about the Apollo 1 fire. I'll be honest with you, I could tell that I think it still hurt him. I think he was still affected by it, but he did tell me that when you see like From the Earth to the Moon depicted it, that it depicted it very real that when they were going to do the investigation, that Jim Webb said, don't worry about protecting me. Don't worry about protecting anybody. You work for Gus, Roger, and Ed during this. He did tell me a story that maybe was in the more recent book about basically him helping Pat persuade the White House that Ed was going to go to West Point to be buried. It was pretty accurately depicted in the book that I read. His story matched up very closely with that. There was some disputing about where he was going to go and where his wishes were to go. So I could tell it still affected him. Ed was his friend. He said the one thing that I thought he said that was always powerful was that if they ever decide to put a picture of an astronaut next to the word in the dictionary, it should be a picture of Ed White. Nice. I always thought that was pretty cool. Somebody here asked him once about could he talk about Ed, and he almost verbatim gave the speech from the Earth to the Moon when he's telling the jury or the hearing about what the astronauts were like. It was incredible. So, when you made friends with Frank, you made it for life, and Ed White, I feel, was probably his best friend. But he did talk about the investigation. I'll tell you that we were out at his house, and he had banker's boxes. He was very organized. And Frank had files and everything that were coming to the museum that we were working with. And I just remember he had one box it was a banker's box that just had Apollo 1 on it. And I remember we would not, out of respect for Frank, open it in front of Frank because we just didn't want to do that. Where the other stuff we would open it up, just kind of see what was in there so we can kind of take a couple pictures real quick and say, okay, we got this stuff, let's put it in the truck. For that one, we just took a picture of the box and with the label, and we just didn't feel it was appropriate, and we didn't want to, we don't want to offend Frank. And there's nothing top secret or crazy in there. It was all the paperwork, the research, the notes he took, and then the hearing, like the prepared books, I guess you would say, for the hearings and things like that. So we have those in our archives here.
Wow. I mean, that's quite an honor to have all that, isn't it? What real honor.
It is. To be trusted with that from what I consider giants. I mean, his exhibit sits right next to the Angle exhibit for Joe and Jeannie, and those are giants of spaceflight right there. And to trust you with it is very special. It's always funny, and I'd love to hear your comments because you guys have both been in it. because I'm sure we all have favorite pieces. Like one of my favorite pieces is literally a picture that Susan took of Frank, Jim, and Bill from across the road, the quarantine road. You know, it was like the night before their launch, and like the Saturn V in the background all lit up, and they're just standing across the road like you see in Apollo 13. And it was just snapshots Susan took. And to me, it was incredible. I mean, that whole journey was incredible. I think it's one of those things that you know while you're doing it, like, this is insane. And the exhibit from a museum professional standpoint is something I'm always going to be proud of. The friendship is something that you can't be friends with someone like that and not be changed. He want to be a better person. He really put me on a track to get healthier, both, you know, physically and mentally. And, you know, I went on a crusade to get healthier and lose weight and just kind of get a little bit more trim. And Frank would actually call me it was about every week or so, to check in to see where I was as I was losing weight. And also to threaten my life that if I ever went the opposite direction, he would, quote, come beat the shit out of me. So
that's an old man who could do damage.
He would. That's
not like a regular old man threatening you. That's an old man who can actually kick an ass.
He would do it.
So yeah, that would inspire me to.
Yeah, I would not want him mad at me.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, but he was a great guy, and he really truly made you want to be a better person. You know, the way he treated Susan, it made me want to, you know, reassess, like, hey, I need to be a Frank in my marriage, you know, and be better, you know, and I need to be better to my friends and coworkers and be better as a professional. I mean, everywhere you could think of, you couldn't spend time with someone like that and not sit back and assess of like, oh wow, I could do this better. And then you would see Frank when he was hit by something, and then how he would react, and you're like, wow, that is, for lack of a better term, that is a man right there. And and I mean that in the sense of like, that is a guy who he should strive to be like. I mean, he was really something else. I can't say enough high praise about him. And again, then the friendship was so unexpected, but I'll cherish it. I mean, it was something that every phone call, I had a nugget of wisdom. And I had one that he said about Deke Slayton. He said, a person who never cheapens his integrity is someone to be valued and looked up to. Nice. And I think Frank also fit that bill. He never realized it when he said that. The other thing he told me was, I can go back. I used to keep notes, and he would tell me something kind of quirky or funny. I had a folder just called Frank said this to me today. My phone. So, he also said, spend your life having fun, because when you get old, the most important thing you'll have are your memories, so make sure they're good ones. And that's one that I really enjoyed. So
I love that.
Okay. So we've had some questions from our Patreon subscribers. Ann Saderquist sent this in. What about the influence that Charles McGee, I believe General Charles McGee, had on Frank in his career? If Chris knows any of Frank's favorite assignments during his military and NASA career, I would also love to hear about that.
Absolutely. Ann is actually one of our museum docents. So hi, Ann. She's probably like right over on the other side of the building. But so for those that don't know, Charles McGee was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American pilot who flew for this country during World War II. They became famous as the Red Tails, but they flew bomber escort, flying fighters during the war. And they actually had a stateside bomber unit as well, trained out of Tuskegee, Alabama. So that was a long, hard fight for those men. But post-war, some of them found command positions, and Colonel McGee, now General McGee, was commanding a P-80 Shooting Star Squadron, one of the first real operational jets this country had. And Frank gets assigned to his unit, the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron. And he said, we walk in, and there he is. And I knew who he was, and I had already highly respected him. And he said, and I'll never forget the first day there. We all walked in. There was like 3 or 4 of us. And he just looks up from his desk, and he goes, a lot of squadron commanders will tell you, you play ball with me, and I'll play ball with you. If you play ball with me, or I'm going to ram the bat right up your ass. And Frank was like, he goes, I never forgot that. And here we were, how many years later, he's like, that was what he told us. So I ran into Charles McGee here, and I'm like, well, Colonel McGee, I was like, can I ask you this question? And you remember staying listening? He goes, who told you that story? And I said, Frank Borman. And he started laughing. He goes, well, Frank told you that story, and then it really happened. He goes, I don't remember swearing, but he goes, if Frank says I did, I did. We actually called him with Frank on the line, and Frank's like, you're the one that said it, So, but until the day we lost both of them, Frank said that General McGee, was one of the greatest leaders he ever served under in the Air Force and at NASA. The P-80 shooting star was one he was very proud of being associated with. And I think each of his space missions that he was very proud of, he was very proud of Apollo 8. Apollo 8, it was pretty much a flawless mission. And that was something he was very proud of. He wanted it to be the perfect mission. What I think a lot of folks don't always realize is it's a mission that arguably is one of the most important space missions ever flown. He was very proud of that.
We had another question from John Wisenhunt, and I think you've kind of covered this, but I think it's a good question. He said, much has been said about Borman's direct, no-nonsense management style. As he became an aerospace elder statesman, such as his EAA and Oshkosh work, did he seem to mellow somewhat?
When it came to business, I think some people sometimes felt or thought that it was, with the cold or whatever, and not that at all. He's very warm, very nice guy. But he wants a schedule, and he wanted to hit your target. And to be honest, he was trying to get the target to you.
Yeah.
You've invited him here, you've flown him here. He was very much a time oriented, where like I would literally hack the time. So if I was supposed to pick him up at 10, and I was there at 9:58, I'd go around the block so that I would roll up right at 10 o'clock, and he'd be like right on time. When it came to like what I would say the business of like the show, or where he was here and he was, going to speak, he wanted to be on time and prep. But as far as like what I would say personality, it surprised me how humorous he really was, and how warm. Because I guess in my head I'd picked up that like this guy's going to be no nonsense all the time, and no, he was no nonsense about like the job at hand. Like let's go up and give a wonderful talk, and I want to hit this mark for you because I'm representing Apollo. I'm representing all the astronauts anytime I talk. But when it came time to like, okay, that's done, he's going to give me grief over bad food or poor choice in apple crisp that I gave him or something like that, and have a good time with that. So hope that answers the question. But I could see absolutely where he was mission driven. He wanted to do a good job, and he didn't want anybody to say, hey, Frank didn't hit the mark or the performance wasn't there. He wanted to make sure people had what they were expecting. I'll tell you a fun story. We were in a gift shop, and he was very wonderfully giving. Like he was just very giving with his time. Like, people would come up and want autographs, and he would absolutely. I mean, just happy to do it. And we tried to, shield as much as we could. People were always gonna get by, and Frank was pretty like, if it wasn't during the air show, if it was an event he was here for, and there's 150 people here to talk, he was like, let him go. I'm happy to sign stuff. If we're talking a few thousand people, then we had to like get him out of here. But we were in the gift shop the one time, and there was a guy who was not sure we had landed on the moon.
Wow.
Approached Frank and said, I don't think we actually landed on the moon. And he goes, but you don't claim to have landed on the moon, so I don't have much of a problem with you. And Frank is trying to buy a book, and he's like, okay. And he goes, well, can I have your autograph? And Frank said, well, if I didn't land on the moon, why do you want my autograph? And he goes, well, in case I'm wrong. And Frank's like, well, catch me after the talk because I don't have a pen on me. And we go out and get my car, and I'm starting it up, and he just kind of gives me a nudge. And I look over, and he's holding a gold pen, and he was like, I have a pen. He's like, if you're going to be stupid, at least be consistent. So I'll never forget that. So I do not believe that gentleman got his autograph, but it was a good time.
That's amazing. All right. So what do you think his peers would say of Frank?
I had that chance to spend some time with his peers, and I think the biggest thing is they all had a level of respect for him. He was one of the guys, if that makes sense. I mean, they would joke with each other and stuff like that. when it came to the work, it felt like if you wanted it done, just put Frank on it. I mean, one of them actually said, "You're never going to have to guess what Frank is thinking because he's going to tell you."
Yeah.
But that there was definitely a level of respect for his work, both in quality and that he would get it done. Just put him on it and stay out of the way, and Frank will take care of it. And that's what I picked up. The only other person I felt that same level of respect, as far as like put that person on it and they'll just get it done, is they all felt that way. At least to me, it feels like they felt that way with Gene Kranz. Gene's boss. He'll take care of you.
So obviously, you mentioned earlier that Frank's claimed that his greatest achievement was getting Susan to marry him. But beyond that, what do you think, perhaps career-wise, what do you think that Frank would most like to be remembered for?
Matt, that is a loaded question right there. Everything I ever talked to him about, he was just very proud of the work that he did on Apollo 8 and Gemini, of course. He was very proud of his time at Eastern. And I know that if you dig into airline history, that, got into a pretty rough time for all airlines. I mean, it was a very interesting time with the airline industry was growing. But to nail down one thing, that's a pretty tough one. But I'll be honest with you, I think he's very proud of the mission he did. But I don't think he hung his hat on it. I think it was what's next. It's hard to even think of something he's more proud of than Susan, to be honest.
Yeah. Wow.
She absolutely meant the world to him. That was his world. I know there's people out there, obviously the Apollo astronauts and Gemini astronauts that knew him at a different time. And I'm sure at that time, Gemini, Apollo, and the mission at hand was important. Hopefully growing young people's interest in aviation was very important to him. I mean, that's why we have what we have. I mean, if you think about it, that could have very easily gone a different way, in a different direction. And Frank knew that. He was very aware of the value of space artifacts. But instead, he wanted them somewhere where everybody could see them. And he told me, like, hopefully some kids will come in here and they'll want to pursue their dreams, whether it's in space flight or wherever. To nail down one thing, that's tough. That's tough. I mean, he's proud of I know he's just very proud of certain portions of his life. West Point, he's very proud of being a graduate from there. But I think complicated. It's just so hard to think of something outside of Susan, to be honest. So sorry, that's probably not an answer.
I think it's a great answer.
Yep, shows us his heart.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing these stories. This has been absolutely amazing, and no less than he deserved, in my opinion.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. And I appreciate it. Hopefully you guys listening enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Very fortunate to get to know him and get to hang out with him and get rogue calls giving me a lot of grief about my poor choice in desserts, things like that. But I appreciate you guys asking me to come on too. It turned out that maybe it was a little bit of healing that I needed as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely.
77 Houston, can you still read us? Sorry to disturb your lunch, but we have a message here we think you'd be interested in. We're coming up on a special time here. Mark, you have just exceeded the world's manned spaceflight endurance record.
Okay, Emily, number one, that was just an amazing interview. And Chris shared such incredible insight there into what clearly had become a very cool friendship between two people, which is just amazing. And hearing Chris talk about it blew me away. And there was definitely some dust in the air. A few moments. But with every story, it just reinforces what I already feel like I know about Frank Borman, which is we don't have enough Frank Bormans in the world.
No. I was talking to my husband last week. This is kind of a diversion, but I was talking to my husband, and I was just talking, like, I feel like that entire generation, that generation born in the late 20s and the early 30s, and especially the Apollo guys, I feel like when they made that generation, they were just built way differently from other people. Like if you look at somebody like Frank, this was somebody, even for somebody of his time, an astronaut of that era, I feel like he was very unique in a lot of ways. Like he was very mission oriented, and he was always just devoted. And I think he was devoted to everything he did, whether it was the mission he was on, even Gemini 7, which frankly does not look like a lot of fun. Having to sit with somebody for 2 friggin' weeks, not my idea of something I'd want to do. Let's just be real. I'd love to go to space, but I would not want to replicate that mission anytime soon. Even if it was with my husband, I would not want to do it. We would murder each other by the end of it. So the fact that he was dedicated to taking that through to me in the 60s is just incredible. But this was somebody who just kind of, for me, it really sums up, almost defines the word devotion. I mean, and to his family as well, and to Susan, to his wife. That is a legendary marriage. They were together for like over 70 years. To me, that's just one of a kind. You don't hear about that.
It's so beautifully portrayed in From the Earth to the Moon. David Andrews and Rita Wilson do such a good job. So much so that I thought it was dramatized. But then you find out it wasn't at all. And perhaps actually the reality was even more intense than how they portrayed it. That love between the two of them, so strong, and I find that fascinating, both for him and Jim Lovell in this instance, especially Frank though, because Frank's such a hard man, right? He's such a hard exterior, I should say, very hard exterior. Does not look like an inviting person, and yet a big softy.
Yeah,
when it comes to his wife and his family. So much love. And, and that's, I think, I don't know if it's because the more you read about him and the more documentaries and the hearing stories like what Chris has told us today, I feel like I knew Frank better than most of the other astronauts, because there are these personal stories that have come out which just show him to be such a human being that you'd want to be like him.
Exactly.
He's one of my ultimate heroes, and I'm absolutely gutted when you sent me the text on Thursday night. Was it Thursday?
Yeah.
It was Thursday, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Thursday.
I was a mess.
I'm very sorry.
Mess.
I just didn't want you to hear it on like Twitter or something like that. By somebody who was like just random. I'd rather you hear it from somebody you knew before you heard it on social media.
Someone on Twitter earlier that day had posted who I knew Frank, posted in celebration of Frank, not explicitly saying what had happened, and in my head I was like, oh no, I have a feeling, and then when you confirmed it, I was like, oh god, genuinely this is one of the big hardest ones of these we've had to deal with since we've started doing this podcast.
Yes.
I just think the world of him. I just think he's an absolute beast of a human being that I'm always going to look up to. And when we have interviewed so many different people about the Apollo program, the amount of times, or when I've read books, the amount of times that Frank Borman seems to be the hero.
He's a main character. Yeah, he is a main character. Yeah.
The amount of times he saved a day, the amount of times he saved a day or did something, you're like, hang on a moment, Frank did that? That's what? That can't be right. He did that as well. Just amazing, and the world really has lost a giant. I think you said it in your obituary at the start. It certainly seems like the end of an era with him. I know there was others around who were with him. This is a big one. This is a real big one.
I've always loved Frank, and I love his book, Countdown. It came out many years ago, but it's still probably available on, my guess is Amazon used books or something like that. So if you can find his biography or autobiography, I would highly recommend it. It is a really good book. Another book that really I like that captured him was Chasing the Moon. The Chasing the Moon, the book that went with the companion to the documentary. And I really loved how that book sort of framed him as kind of the hero of the Apollo program, because when people think, and this, I don't want anybody to take this as a diss to Neil Armstrong by any stretch of the imagination. But when most people think of Apollo, they think, oh, Neil Armstrong, first man to walk on the moon. And I think even Armstrong would admit that Frank is the one who helped get the program back together after the Apollo 1 fire. He's the one who kind of set the tone for that to happen. In that book, Frank really emerges as the hero, sort of bringing everything back together and saving the program in many ways. And a lot of people just do not know that. Frank, I think, gets overlooked in a lot of ways because he didn't walk on the moon. He also, I think, promoted sort of a kind of healing in the program as well because, there was a lot of anger after that happened, understandably. They'd lost 3 people who were very much valued in the program. Frank had lost his best friend. That couldn't have been easy for Frank to go through. And I think really he's one of the underrated heroes in getting everything back together. So Apollo 8 could happen. So Apollo 11 happened on time. They got it done before the end of the decade. So I admire him a lot for that. But like we both said, I mainly admire him for his devotion to his wife, especially in her later years, because he was taking care of her in her later years. Start to finish, he was devoted to her.
Oh, that quote from Chris where he said, "I need to be more like Frank in my marriage." That was like, oh wow, that was a really powerful thing that Chris said.
Well, I think I could be too. This is somebody who is very selfless and very devoted. Devoted. That word keeps coming up in my speech, but I feel like he is like the definition of that. He was just devoted to everything he did.
Yeah.
He carried it all the way through the end. He didn't want to be the person people are like, man, he really half-assed that or something like that.
Yeah.
But he did that in every manner of his life, I feel. And that's not a quality you see a lot. To me, that's something to be admired. Like what Chris said about integrity. He talked about Deke Slayton, and this was somebody who approached everything with a sense of integrity. Frank, I think that could sum him up like that as well. And I don't know if we'll see people like that again.
Oh, I hope so. I've got 2 more points. Number 1, I'm very disappointed, and this carries on from what you said earlier. I was very disappointed with almost a lack of coverage since Frank died in the mainstream press. It has existed, and it's there. If you look hard enough on the BBC, you'll find an article. They talked about him on Radio 4 for a little bit, which is cool, and so on and so forth. When Neil Armstrong died, it was front page news. Rightly so. I'm not saying it shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
I love Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, we're not dissing Neil. We're not dissing him.
He's in my top 5, of which I've got a top 50, and Neil's in my top 5 alongside Frank. Right, but what Frank achieved with Apollo 8 gets so overlooked in terms of the importance. That mission is arguably a harder mission than Apollo 11. There's more unknowns in that mission than Apollo 11. It was more historic in many ways than Apollo 11, and that mission on a whole doesn't get the credit it deserves. But he was the commander of that mission.
Yeah, it was risky as hell. I don't think a lot of people believe they would come back from that.
Absolutely.
It was basically a crude test flight. I mean, that's what it was.
There's another aspect of that, which is in Teasel Muhammad's book, Operation Moonglow, you learn that Frank was also a politician. He was sent on his own world tour, on his own, to go and meet dignitaries. He was sent out after that. When you get to Apollo 11, they were there together, and I know Neil was amazing on those tours. Both Buzz and Mike say how great Neil was. But Frank was sent to these places on his own. Go and meet the Queen on your own. Go and meet all these people on your own. And he was incredible. He lit up a room. Apparently his speeches were stopping people, and you don't necessarily equate that with Frank. The more you find out about him, the more you realize how incredible he was as a person. And my final thoughts on his passing, Emily, I often get asked, why do I love space so much? Why do I love the Apollo program so much? And sure, I love the moon. Think it's fascinating. I love looking at it. I love looking at it through a telescope. I would love to go there. I'd love to walk on the surface. I love the ambition of what they tried to do with the Apollo program. But the thing that's really, really grabs me is the people that did it, the people that were involved. And if I was to put my finger on one person who I think is the embodiment of all of everything I love about Apollo, it's Frank Borman.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Every single thing, that it would be him. And that's why I think this really is a huge loss. Huge loss.
Absolutely. There's a National Geographic, I think it was from 1964, and it was after Mercury and before Gemini, whatever. And so there was a Nat Geo, and the last picture on the last page of an astronaut was Frank Borman. And I felt that was fitting because it sort of introduced, it was like, this is the face of one of the astronauts who will be flying Gemini. And I was like, to me, that was very appropriate and timely that they put that in there, because I feel like he defined a lot of the future of spaceflight at that point. Even back then, they kind of knew this person has that quality that they're going to define a lot of this era.
Yeah, absolutely. And he really did. He really did. As always, the full interview will be available on our Patreon page for those who wish to watch it. And links to Chris's social media and the EAA Museum will be in our show notes, which you can find at spaceandthingspodcast.com, or click in the link in the description of this podcast episode in your podcast provider. Now, this interview and what we've just talked about is longer than we aim normally with interviews, but we think this is a topic where we didn't want to limit it. So we're not going to do a What Caught Our Eye in Spaceflight this week. But what I will say is some happier news. Fred Hayes turned 90 today as we record this. And when we talk about giants and we talk about amazing people and how these people were built slightly different, ain't there another example right there? So happy birthday, Fredo.
Yes, happy birthday.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Thanks for joining us this week. Another sad episode, but we hope that we honoured the memory of Frank Borman in a really positive way.
We'll be back next week, but don't forget, in space, no one can hear you meeing.
This has been the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.